this street, and this became a little Muslim ghetto.
And this leads to real hardship. There's a period of time where, according to the tradition, they're actually eating from the leaves of trees.
Famine destroyed the fortunes of Muhammad's protector Abu Talib and his follower Abu Bakr. The survival of both the clan and Islam were in jeopardy. But for Muhammad, the damage hit even closer to home.
Khadija, Muhammad's beloved wife, perhaps weakened by the privations, actually died. And that was just a crippling blow for him. It left him feeling alone and vulnerable and weak. He would miss her all his life, I think. Then the catastrophe happened that Abu Talib died, perhaps himself weakened by the deprivation in food. Now, without Abu Talib, Muhammad was fair game for assassination. And there's a terrible moment where he utters this heartbreaking prayer, saying, "Oh my God, I have no other protector but you, Allah." And how was he going to move forward? He'd done what Allah had told him to do. He proclaimed this message, and all he seemed to have done was stir up hostility and hatred, and split his tribe down the middle. This wasn't improving matters. He must have felt in almost a sort of a dark night of the soul.
He is at the low point of his mission. He's been almost 13 years now in Mecca, and the results are not impressive. But at this point, at this low ebb, he is now being prepared for the most extraordinary mystical experience of his prophetic life, and that is what is known as the night ascension.
The story goes that one night he was sleeping near the Kaaba, and he was woken from sleep by Gabriel, who mounted him on a burak, a magical steed, and they flew from Mecca to Jerusalem. And then he began an ascent up through the seven heavens to the divine throne. At every stage of the heavens, he meets various prophets of the past. He meets Abraham, he meets Jesus and John the Baptist, he meets Moses. And finally, he enters into the divine presence, and there the sources are silent, because when you enter into the presence of God, you've gone beyond words.
And he receives from God the highest form of knowledge and truth, and many injunctions of the religion itself, including the final form of the daily prayers. Now, all of this took place in a time beyond time. That's why some sources say that as the door was swinging when he left, he was still swinging when he came back.
For later Muslims, this also meant that the departure point, that is, Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock, became also important. Muslims say that there are three holy cities in Islam: Mecca, and Medina, the city of the Prophet, and Jerusalem.
When he comes back, somebody asks him, what have you been doing? And he says, I went to Jerusalem last night. And this man says, you went to Jerusalem last night? Are you willing to say that publicly? So they assemble this group and they tell him, describe for us Jerusalem. And he begins to describe it in very exact detail. And they're shocked. They don't know what to make of this now.
The story of the night journey not only incited Muhammad's enemies, it caused doubt even among some of his followers.
This is something they hadn't really expected. A journey that takes them a month to be made in an evening and to come back. What Abu Bakr says is, listen, I believe that he's getting messages from God. That is certainly more extraordinary than making a night journey to Jerusalem.
As Muhammad's relationship with the Meccans continued to deteriorate, his enemies decided that the time had come to eliminate him.
And they decide to get a youth from each clan. They all come together and they're going to strike him with one blow together. So the blood is distributed amongst all the clans.
Under cover of darkness, the assassins surrounded Muhammad's home. Inside, a covered figure lay asleep. As dawn broke, they prepared to strike. But Muhammad had been forewarned about the plot. He asked his cousin Ali, whom he knew the Quraysh would not harm, to take his place. By the time the assassins burst into his home, Muhammad and his companion Abu Bakr had escaped into the desert. With the Meccans in hot pursuit, they set out on a circuitous route to the oasis settlement of Yathrib, 250 miles to the north. For several months, Muhammad had been sending his followers there for refuge. Now, he was about to join them.
Yathrib was quite different from Mecca. It was an agricultural settlement. People grew dates and they had farms, and there were a number of clans and tribes living together in the settlement. The settlement was engulfed in tribal warfare of the worst kind. It was an example of where the whole system in Arabia was beginning to break down. One killing led to another, and nobody could seem to find a solution.
Nobody, that is, until the clans of Yathrib heard about the trustworthy Muhammad. Hoping he could unify its warring factions, which included two major pagan tribes and their Jewish allies, a delegation from Yathrib had taken the dramatic step of inviting Muhammad to move to their settlement.
The deal is that he will serve as their binding arbitrator. That is, both sides to the conflict have agreed already that they will accept the arbitration of Muhammad, whatever it would be.
The people of Yathrib vowed that they would take the Muslims on board as honorary tribesmen. They would be their protectors. Anyone who hurt the Muslims, they would retaliate, and the Muslims agreed to do the same. This move from your tribe to join up with people who were of no kin to you at all was absolutely unheard of. Muhammad was really going off into the wilderness here. He was breaking every tie, doing something utterly shocking and novel.
When Prophet Muhammad was leaving, he stood up on a hill, and he was looking on Mecca, and his tears were coming down of his eyes, and he talked to Mecca and he said, God knows that I love you, Mecca, so much, but it is your people who are chasing me out.
In Yathrib, Muhammad's followers anxiously awaited the Prophet's arrival. Had the man they hoped would save them been able to save himself? Had the Meccans captured or even killed him? When Muhammad finally reached the outskirts of the city, his relieved followers rushed to greet him with a song Muslims around the world still sing 1,400 years later. Muhammad's arrival marked the beginning of a dramatic new chapter in the history of Islam. For the first time, he would be the leader of a sovereign community based on Islamic law. Yathrib would henceforth become known as Medina.
Muhammad arrives in Medina as somebody who's escaping danger. He's been invited there, but he doesn't know what to expect. So at each stage of his life, there's a new challenge. and obviously new fears and new doubts. And so he started thinking in terms of policy, in terms of strategy, in terms of tactics. And that's what ultimately made him into a statesman, because that's what statesmen do.
Now, unlike Jesus or the Buddha, who seem to have been purely spiritual leaders with no temporal responsibilities whatever, Muhammad found himself now head of state, having transferred the Muslim families from Mecca to Medina. He now had to make sure they could survive there.
The survival of the fledgling community depended on its ability to defend itself against attacks from Mecca. To respond to this possibility, Muhammad developed a novel political solution.
He essentially establishes a pact, an agreement. Sometimes it's called the Constitution of Medina. Whether you were a pagan or a Muslim, or a member of the Jewish tribes or any other tribes in Medina, you had to sign on to this pact. And the pact established that if there were ever an attack on Medina from the outside, all the inhabitants of the town would be responsible to defend the city. This way, Muhammad really developed a revolutionary idea, which was transcend your tribal responsibilities, your petty particularism, and begin to think in larger terms as an entire community.
Now, this was a very fearful, terrifying time for Muslims, but nevertheless, it was seen as a time when the faith was at its strongest. It's a creative act for Muslims to look back at the Muslim community in Medina and try to apply the ideals to their own society so that they can reproduce something of the Prophet's original spirit.
I came here to this country, and I came with a feeling that I left back in my original country in Iraq many memories, many painful memories. One of them that my grandfather, as well as 13 members from my family, were persecuted and imprisoned by the dictator Saddam Hussein. That reminds me of the agony and pain many early immigrants went through when they came to Medina.
Like many other Muslims who have fled persecution in their native countries, Imam Hassan Qazwini was drawn to America by the promise of religious freedom and economic opportunity. He emigrated to Dearborn, Michigan, a city that has the highest per capita concentration of Muslims in the United States, where people are almost as likely to speak Arabic as English.
Hijrah, migration, it has a shining aspect for me, as well as the Prophet and his companions who came with him from Mecca to Medina. And that shining aspect was the freedom, religious freedom that they faced in Medina. Muslims here in America, they feel they are more free in practicing their religion than many other Muslim countries.
Subhanallah, subhanallah, subhanallah.
In many ways, this whole immigration process from Mecca to Medina very much parallels what's happened in my own city here in Dearborn, in our own backyard. And I see it play out in the hospital where I work.
بيتكلم عربي فما مشكلة أبدا بس ولكن إذا تحتاجين أي كان شيء هو بيتصل فيي وأنا برجع بتصل فيكم.
Najah Bazi is a nurse at Dearborn's Oakwood Hospital. She conducts training sessions to help bridge the gap of understanding between the hospital staff and their Muslim patients, many of whom are immigrants.
I know you're all nurses, and I know that you're in this profession, just as I am, to serve, to do a good job. But it's real easy for us to get caught up in our own baggage. We're all human, and we all have a certain set of preconceived notions, just as you walked through the door and you saw me for the first time, just as you might have seen Alia. In the sensitivity training, inevitably, they know very little about the faith of Islam. They think that the faith of Islam is a very maybe terroristic, militant, barbaric, spread by the sword faith. And so when they have a Muslim up there talking about patient rights,